Chapter 2. Interaction with Information. George is fascinated with archaeology. From a distance, that is. He's been interested in it ever since he saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he's decided to try and teach himself about it by picking up as many books as he can, 5 to be exact, all at the same time. He downloads them on his e-reader. For a couple of days, these 5 books don't do much except look back at him through his screen. He didn't think through which books would be most suitable for his expertise level, which right now could be charitably described as modest. He just went for a couple that were bestsellers and another because it was $1.99. But so what? Those 5 books should at least be enough to familiarize him with basic archaeology knowledge. They should be catered to people that are starting from ground zero. He should be able to pick up what he needed. Should. The bane of all reasonable expectations. George starts to read one of the books by an archaeologist who had extensive experience working at the pyramids in Egypt. He figures he should start with someone that was right at the source, not taking into consideration his own level of expertise. This book has a long preface, but he never reads prefaces. He just wants to get to the meat. The first chapter instantly gives him a roadblock. There are a bunch of long words that seem specific to archaeologists that he doesn't get. But that's okay. He'll just power through it, because he's a fast reader. He read all the volumes of the Hunger Games series in a week. He'll get this, no problem. George is mentally depleted at the end of the first chapter because he hasn't considered anything he's read. He doesn't know what it means or why it's important. He had to keep reading paragraphs over and over, though he stubbornly refused to consult a dictionary. He still finished Chapter 1 relatively quickly, but he has no interest in moving on to Chapter 2. It's too depressing and discouraging. So he picks up another book that he got and has the exact same experience. George considers all this a divine sign and decides he wasn't meant to study archaeology at all. He thinks he clearly doesn't have the mental resources necessary to pursue the subject. He closes his e-book a little depressed and dejected, thinking that he's too stupid. But George isn't stupid. In fact, he was one of the best students in his high school class, and he routinely aced tests without studying. His downfall was his expectations of his own initial abilities and how they would react to new knowledge and reading material. He might be smart, but not in this field. When he failed to immediately grasp it, he considered it his own personal failure. But that's only because he tried to read a book of knowledge the same way that he read juvenile fiction, or anything that was thrown at him in high school. He had no plan and wasn't prepared for what self-learning really requires. Since those styles of writing are completely different, and because you also have a different purpose in mind, assimilation and comprehension of new information and knowledge, they need to be approached in completely different ways. Interacting with information isn't just about expectations, it's about planning. To start with, George should have tried using the SQ3R method, a method that can be transformative in your self-learning quest. The SQ3R method. For the large majority of school subjects, textbooks are the core of the study program, along with lectures and discussions. A typical teacher's entire lesson plan for a year usually draws from the structure and sequence of at least one textbook. These volumes are, more often than not, forbiddingly big. Multiply one large book by the number of classes a student has in any given semester, and you've got a seriously overweight backpack, nearly as heavy as every one of your teacher's expectations that you read every single one. Textbooks are dense, detailed, heavily annotated, and long. It's easy to conjure up the image of a student late at night glossing over page 349 of a giant volume, growing fatigued and unable to retain the words they're reading the next morning. That's why American educator Francis P. Robinson developed a method meant to help students really get the most comprehension from the text they're assigned, and ergo, the subject they're studying. Robinson sought a way to make reading more active, helping readers by creating dynamic engagement with books, so the information stuck in their minds. The traditional classroom setting of reading and regurgitating certainly isn't the most effective, but it's the only model most of us know. Robinson's approach is suitable for more than just reading. Your entire study plan can be modeled on Robinson's method and adapted to your self-learning. The technique is called the SQ3R method, named for its 5 components: survey, question, read, recite, review. Survey. The first step in the method is getting a general overview of what you'll be reading. Textbooks and nonfiction works aren't like fiction or narrative literature in which you would start from the beginning and wind your way through each chapter. The best works of nonfiction are arranged to impart information in a way that's clear and memorable, and builds upon each previous chapter. If you go dive in without surveying first, you are going in blind, without understanding where you are going and what you are trying to accomplish. You should get a lay of the land first, before you delve into Chapter 1. The survey component is for you to get the most general introduction to the topic so you can establish and shape the goals you want to achieve from reading the book. It's just like taking a look at the entire map before you set off on a road trip. You may not need all the knowledge at the moment, but understanding everything as a whole and how it fits together will help you with the small details when you're in the weeds. You'll know that you generally need to head southwest if you're confused. In the SQ3R method, surveying means examining the structure of the work, the book title, the introduction or preface, section titles, chapter titles, headings and subheadings. If the book is illustrated with pictures or graphs, you'd review them. You also make note of the conventions the book uses to guide your reading, typefaces, bold or italic text, and chapter objectives and study questions if they're in there. In using the survey step, you're setting up expectations for what you're going to be reading about and giving yourself an initial framework to structure your goals for reading the material. For example, let's say you're reading a book to learn more about geology. I happen to have one called Geology Illustrated by John S. Shelton. It's about 50 years old and no longer in print, but it works fine for our purposes. There's a preface describing what's in the book and how the illustrations are arranged. There's an unusually extensive table of contents divided into parts: materials, structure, sculpture, time, case histories, and implications. That tells me that the book will start with concrete, excuse the pun, geological elements. Will flow into how they form over time, important incidents, and what we might expect in the future. That's a pretty good guess at the arc of the book. Each part is then divided into chapters, which are further divided into a ton of headings and subheadings, too many to mention here. But they give a more nuanced summary of what each part will go into. When you survey and know the significance of what you're currently learning, you are able to instantly comprehend it better. It's the difference between looking at a single gear in isolation versus seeing where and how it works in a complex clock. Beyond books, you should survey all the important concepts in a discipline. If you can't find it within a structure like a book's table of contents, then you need to be able to create it for yourself. Yes, this is the difficult part, but once you are able to lay all the concepts out and understand how they relate to each other, at least on a surface level, you will already be leaps ahead of others. Use the survey component to form an outline of what you'll learn. In a sense, it's more like you're plotting out a metaphorical book for yourself. You want to form a general outline of what you're going to learn. Since you're studying this on your own, there might be a few gaps in what you think you'll need to know. So in this phase, you'll want to determine exactly what you want to become knowledgeable about, as specifically as you can make it. For example, if you want to learn all about psychology, that's going to take a significant amount of time. It won't happen in one shot. You'd want to specify it a little more. The early history of psychoanalysis, the works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, sports psychology, developmental psychology. The possibilities are plenty. You'll want to keep an eye out for phrases or concepts that appear in several different sources, since they represent elements that come up often in your chosen field, and might be things you have to know. Draw connections and cause and effect relationships before even diving into any of the concepts in detail. For example, let's say you want to study the history of European cinema. Entering European cinema history into Google brings up a lot of interesting possibilities, and some of those can be used to form the outline you want. You can look for reading materials on Amazon.com, finding the ones that seem most authoritative. The Internet Movie Database, IMDb, can help you find the most important European films you want to watch. You can discover which European directors are the most cited and appear to be the most important and influential. You can research which European movies are the highest rated and why. You can collect a few resources on what specific countries had what cinematic movements and why. Then you'll organize these resources. You'll come up with a plan to study each one, perhaps study a chapter in a book on early European film history. Then watch a couple of films that represent the era you're on at the moment, and give yourself a film review assignment afterwards. Focus on gathering and organizing. You don't need to touch them yet. The important aspect is that you've surveyed the topic before diving in, and thus understand what you're getting into and why. Question. In the second stage of the SQ3R method, you're still not diving into the deep end. During the question stage, you'll work a little more deeply to get your mind more prepared to focus and interact with the material you're reading. You'll take a slightly closer look at the structure of the book and form some questions you wanted answered, or set up the objectives you want to achieve. In the question phase of reading a book, or more precisely at this point, preparing to read, you'd go through the chapter titles, headings, and subheadings, and rephrase them in the form of a question. This turns the dry title the author has given into a challenge or problem for you to solve. For example, if you're reading a book on Freud, there might be a chapter called Foundations of Freud's Analyses of Dreams. You'd rewrite this chapter title as, how did Sigmund Freud's work on dream interpretation originate, and what were his very first ideas on the subject? You could pencil that question in the margin of your book. If you're reading a textbook with study questions at the ends of the chapters, those serve as excellent guides to what you're about to find out. In the geology book, I'm afraid there aren't too many chapter titles that I could rephrase as inquiries. Weathering, groundwater, glaciation, that's about it. But there are headings that might work. Some effects of metamorphism on sedimentary rocks, for example, can become what can happen to bottom-centered rocks through eons of environmental change. Not only have I changed it to a question, but I've paraphrased the title into wording that I can understand even before I've started reading. Now that you've organized your resources for study planning, you can arrange some of the topics you're going to cover into questions you want answered or objectives that you want to meet. Based on the source material you've lined up and the patterns that you might have observed, what specific answers are you hoping to find in your studies? Write them down. This is also a good time to come up with a structure for answering your own questions. A daily journal, a self-administered quiz, some kind of knowledge tracker. You don't have to answer the questions yet. You just need to know how you're going to record them when you do. In our European film history example, if you've done even the most cursory investigation in the survey phase, you'll undoubtedly come across some directors' names more than once. Federico Fellini, Jean-Luc Godard, Luis Buñuel, Fritz Lang, and so forth. You figure they're going to be important people to get to know, so you could ask the question, why was Fellini so influential? What was Buñuel's directing style? What themes did Godard pursue in his filmmaking? You might have come across certain concepts or themes that seemed common in European film. French New Wave, World War II, Neo-realism, for example. Put these down as targets for your study and arrange them into your outline. Reading. In this stage, you're finally ready to dive into the material, because you've gotten a lay of the land and formed some questions and goals for your studies. You're a little more engaged when you finally sit down to read. You're looking for answers to the questions you've raised. Another underrated aspect of formulating and organizing before you actually begin reading is to build anticipation for learning. You've been looking over everything for a while now, and you'll probably be eager to finally dive in and answer the questions you've been mentally accumulating. This step is where most people try to start but fail because they lack a foundation and instead have unreasonable expectations. Now you're being deliberate and paced about your reading so you can comprehend better. This means slowing down. A lot. Be patient with the material and with yourself. If a passage is difficult to understand, read it extremely slowly. If you aren't getting a sense of clarity about a certain part, stop, go back to the beginning, and reread it. It's not like you're reading a page-turner novel that you can't put down. You're reading information that might be densely packed, so read it slowly and attentively, one section at a time. Chances are that reading is part of your study plan, but so might visual aids, online courses, and internet resources. Use them exactly the way you'd use the book in the reading phase, deliberately and persistently, with the goal of fully understanding each concept you're being taught. If you get lost, remember the rewind button and scrolling are your best buddies. Plan your study time around getting as complete a level of comprehensiveness as you can. With our European film history example, this is obvious. Watch your films with a critical eye. At certain points, you might want to rewind to catch visual images, dialogue, or action that might be pertinent. If you can watch a video with the director's commentary audio track, you'll want to spend an afternoon with that. Cross-check the movies with books you're reading or the online courses you're taking to answer any questions or lines of thought you might have. Reciting. This step is crucial in processing the information you're learning about, and is the biggest difference between reading to learn and reading for entertainment. Now that you're familiar with the material, the aim of the reciting phase is to reorient your mind and attention to focus and learn more fully as you go along. In other words, this step is about literal recitation. Ask questions, out loud, verbally, about what you're reading. This is also the point where you take copious notes in the margins of the text and underline or highlight key points. Recitation is verbal and also through writing. However, it's important to restate these points in your own words, rather than just copy phrases from a book onto a piece of paper. By doing this, you're taking the new knowledge and putting it into phrases of which you already know the meaning. This makes the information easier to grasp in a language you understand. It makes it significant and meaningful to you. My geology book happens to have pretty wide margins on the sides of the pages, so I have some nice room to rephrase and rewrite key points as well as highlight important concepts. For example, consider the following original text. This comparison suggests that the slow progress of erosion on hills and mountains is similar to the much more rapid and observable changes seen in miniature all about us. I could rewrite the above into something like this. Mountains and hills experience the same decay as happens in lowlands and rivers, just more slowly, similar to baseball players. What I'm doing here is putting one single bit of information into two distinct phrases, one of which I had to come up with myself. This is a huge tool that's used in memorization, and it's also a great way to make the information more meaningful to me personally. I also added a bit about baseball because I like baseball, and it makes the concept instantly understandable when I look back at it. Repeated throughout the course of a whole book, this process multiplies your learning capacity by itself. The recitation phase in organizing your studies is great because it works across different mediums, and there are plenty of ways you can express your questions and restatements. Going back to our European cinema example, if you're watching Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, short summary, medieval knight meets angel of death, tries to buy time by playing chess with him. You might write down questions about its biblical references, the art direction, the Middle Ages references, or the cinematography. You could also write a summary or do a video blog of the movie and address the key sequences that are most relevant to your questions. You could also compare it to other films by Bergman, or note similarities his style has with other directors that you're studying. The important part is that you're taking the time to rephrase and recite new knowledge and make it meaningful to you and no one else. Review. The final stage of the SQ3R plan is when you go back over the material that you've studied, refamiliarize yourself with the most important points, and build your skills at memorizing the material. Robinson breaks down this stage into specific days of the week, but we'll just mention some of the tactics in general. They include writing more questions of important parts you have highlighted, orally answering some of the questions if you can, reviewing your notes, creating flashcards for important concepts and terminology, rewriting the table of contents using your own words, and building out a mind map. Any kind of practice that helps you drill down, take in, and commit information to memory is fair game, though flashcards are especially effective. This step is meant to strengthen your memory of the material, but it does more than that. It can help you see connections and similarities between different aspects that you might not have picked up at first, and put concepts and ideas into greater context. It also can improve your mental organization skills so you can use this practice for other topics. Think of this step as the natural continuation of the survey step. At this point, you've gained an outline of the field. You've gotten into the nitty-gritty, and now you should take a step back, reevaluate, and make updated, more accurate, and insightful connections. Pair that with memorization, and your path to self-learning and expertise becomes essentially a shortcut. My geology book has no shortage of terms that I could put onto flashcards. Monocline, stratification, glacial scour. Whip out the Sharpie now. But I could also map out the process of glaciation in a flowchart or some other visual medium. I could make a timeline of the ages of the Earth and link it with the most significant geological changes that took place during each era. I can also take down questions that come up that the book either left unanswered or made me want to investigate more fully. You can use most elements of the book review phase for study planning in the same way. In our European cinema example, you could make a catalog or database for European film directors that outlines their work, their main themes, or their stylistic choices. You can draw up flashcards that will help you recall the important facets of different European strains: neo-realism, giallo horror, spaghetti western, and cinema de look. And of course, you can journal what you've learned, either in written form or some visual expression. The SQ3R method is no joke. It's exhaustive and detailed and will take patience and sharp organization to pull off. But if you give yourself the patience and devotion to take each step seriously and slowly, you'll find it incredibly helpful to tackle a complex subject. And each time you do it, it's a little easier than the last. In explaining the SQ3R method, we briefly skimmed the role of organization and notes, and how they impact self-learning. After all, you can't organize everything in your head only and hope to be effective. When you eventually need to write down what you've learned or organized, there's a specific method of note-taking that will be most beneficial. Cornell Notes. The most famous method of note-taking is called the Cornell method, and elements relate to what we covered earlier. Here's how it works. On a handwritten sheet for note-taking, writing by hand is key. Split it down the middle and into two columns. Make the column on the right about twice the size as the column on the left. Label the right column Notes and label the left column Cues. Leave a couple of inches empty at the bottom of the page and label that section Summary. Now you have 3 distinct sections, but you will only be taking notes in the Notes section on the right. This is where you take normal notes on the bigger concepts with supporting details as concisely as possible. Write everything you need to make a thorough assessment of what you're learning. Make sure to skip some space between points so you can fill in more detail and clarification at a later point. Draw charts and diagrams, make lists where appropriate, and give your best effort to capturing what matters. You don't need to think about organization or highlighting while you are taking the initial notes. Just write what you hear or read, and give as complete of a picture as possible. Record as much as possible in the right column, as you just want to capture information at this point. Don't discriminate. When you go over the notes again, you can figure out what is necessary and important. After you're done taking notes, move on to the left Cues side. This is where, for each section or concept, you filter and analyze the notes side, and write the important parts on the Cues side. Where the Notes side is more of a jumbled mess, The cues side is a relatively organized account of the topic at hand. Basically, the same information is on each side. Turn 5 sentences of normal notes into 1 or 2 sentences with a main point and supporting facts. Hopefully you can picture it. On the left is an organized set of statements that sum up everything neatly, while on the right is a jumble of messy writing. At this point, you've already achieved the second level of taking notes, as we talked about before. You've already gone a level above what you normally do, and you can already skim the paper and instantly know what the notes are about. Finally, after you're done with the notes and cues sides, move to the summary section at the bottom. This is where you attempt to summarize everything you've just taken notes on into a few top-level ideas and statements, with only the important supporting facts or exceptions to the rules. You want to say as much in as few words as possible, because when you review your notes, you want to be able to understand quickly and not have to deconstruct or analyze all over again. You want to be able to skim the summary and cues section and move on. Where you previously had one page full of messy notes, now you have a short summary section where you can instantly gain understanding of new information. It also allows you to memorize more effectively, as again it's just a few sentences versus a page you would have to analyze every time. And once again, synthesizing for one more repetition doesn't hurt. As a quick example, why don't we review what we've been talking about in this lesson? Suppose we are taking Cornell notes on this concept itself. On the right side will be as much as you can capture. It won't be verbatim, and you'll probably need to write in short phrases. But it is not too organized. It's just a mass of information based on what you've heard. On the left side, you'll have a few shorter phrases, such as the 4 stages of notes, and what happens in each stage, how Cornell notes function, and their importance in learning better. As for the summary section, you would boil everything you've learned from this lesson down into 1 or 2 sentences. There are 4 stages of learning: taking notes, editing, analysis, reflection. Cornell Notes forces you to go through all 4 stages and helps you organize information better with 3 sections to enforce information. You have created your own study guide. Better yet, you also have the entire process you used to create it documented on the same page, from original notes to synthesis and summarization. You have a record of information that allows you to go as deep as you want or refer to whatever you want. The most important part is that you've created something that has personal significance to you because you've phrased everything in a way in which you derive meaning. You are making the information fit your mental scheme, not the other way around. Overall, taking notes is not a lazy, passive activity. That's the real secret of great notes. They are intended to serve as something you can refer to, instantly understand, and find helpful, as opposed to having to decipher them. This won't work if you have to first try to understand someone else's sense of structure and organization. Peter Brown, the author of the book Make It Stick, simplifies this point on notes. He maintains that when no effort is put into the learning process, it doesn't last very long. In one study Brown cited, students were allowed to copy notes word for word on some material, but were asked to rephrase other material in their own words. When these students were tested later, they did a far better job of recalling the material they had paraphrased themselves. It may be convenient for the students, if not the professor, to provide written notes for lectures, but the lack of effort this arrangement inherently has will handicap the student. In fact, the less effort and involvement a student is able to use to get by, the worse the learning will be. Your notes are how your brain will process, understand, and memorize information. That means you need to make sure you have a good foundation to start with. The best final practice on interacting with information for self-starters is the art of self-explanation. Again, you may recognize elements of this from the SQ3R method, specifically the part about recitation. Self-explanation. Self-explanation sounds simple, but there is a method to the simplicity. It's more than thinking out loud. It involves explaining and articulating information to establish a baseline of knowledge and blind spots. Blind spots are when we don't realize what we don't know. But with self-explanation, you will quickly learn what you don't understand, and it might be far more than you expected. Here's how it can sometimes show itself in real life. If you've been around small children under age 7 or so, you have witnessed or experienced, if you're a parent, a phenomena we call the why chain. This is when kids ask an initial question about the world, say, where does rain come from? And, after hearing our answer, from clouds, continue down a path of relentless questions to get at a definitive ending answer. Why don't the clouds hold in the rain? Why can't the clouds just fall to the earth, still shaped like clouds? Why don't the clouds on a sunny day let rain go? Yes, this line of questioning can be a recipe for tedium, but it's reflective of a child's innate capacity for endless curiosity for a definitive answer. For parents, of course, this point usually comes a lot earlier. Elaborative interrogation has something in common with that childlike inquiry, except it relates to more advanced topics that adults are, hopefully, liable to investigate. Simply put, elaborative interrogation is an effort to create explanations for why stated facts are true. This is what drives home comprehension, as well as what you don't comprehend. In elaborative interrogation, the learner inquires about how and why certain concepts work. Nothing is safe from this inquiry. They go through their study materials to determine the answers and try to find connections between all the ideas they're learning about. Can you answer simple questions, or at least understand what the answer is likely to be? Why questions are more significant than what questions, and primarily relate to the natures of identification and memorization. A line of why questions elicits a better understanding of the factors and reasons for a given subject. We can memorize all the parts of a flower, the petal, the stamen, the pistil, the receptacle, and so on. But the names alone mean nothing to us. We have to ask what each part of a flower does, and why that role is integral to its lifespan. This method is effective because it's simple and anyone can apply it easily. Elaborative interrogation does, however, require some existing knowledge about the topic to generate solid questions for yourself. Elaborative interrogation could proceed like this, and suppose you're learning about the Great Depression of the 1930s. The first thing you'd ask would be, well, what was it? It was the biggest worldwide economic breakdown in the history of the industrialized world. What caused the Great Depression? A few key events, like the stock market crash of October 1929, the failure of over 9,000 banks, declines in consumer spending, high tax imports from Europe, and drought conditions in the agricultural sector. Let's talk about the stock market crash. Why did it happen? Some experts were concerned about margin selling, declines in the British stock market, out-of-control speculation, and some questionable business practices in the steel industry. Margin selling. What was that? How did margin selling work, and why was it a problem? Margin selling, or margin trading, is when an investor borrows money from a broker to buy stock. So many investors used it that most stock purchases were bought with this borrowed money. It worked so well that the stock prices went up, and when the asset bubble popped, prices fell off. Since the investor had no funds to repay the loan, both the broker and the investor had no profit to show for it. And the chain of interrogation goes on from there. You use your study materials to obtain the answers to the why and how questions. Once you've sufficiently established those answers, you go back to the other aspects of the Great Depression and the stock market crash and determine how each aspect related to one another. How did margin selling affect the banks? How did margin selling relate to the decline in consumer spending? Did the drought affect the trade issues with Europe? The overall point of elaborative interrogation is to make sure there are no holes in your understanding. If you can survive your own questioning, it's likely you can survive tests, exams, and when other people ask you to teach them. You can start with journalistic questions: who, what, where, when, why, how. Then move on to contextual questions. How did this happen, and what happens after? for a good and thorough start to understanding. The range of topics for which you can use elaborative interrogation is practically limitless. For example, math students can use it to break down advanced calculations and establish patterns that might help in higher-level math topics. If you're studying human biology, you can use the technique to determine the specific conditions that led to medical conditions like high cholesterol or heart arrhythmia. Even students of literature can use the technique to study motifs, trends, and themes in a particular author's work. Elaborative interrogation, when you think about it, is a form of self-explanation. You are quizzing yourself and then putting yourself on the spot as to whether you can answer or not. You should be able to see how this lets you know where you lack comprehension and facts. Having knowledge is of course important to learning, but sometimes not having blind spots is just as important. The Feynman technique. Elaborative interrogation is one method of asking yourself questions that focuses on you seeing the whole picture behind a piece of information. You can use the journalistic questions or contextual and background questions. The Feynman technique, named for Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, is another type of discussing with yourself. Known as the Great Explainer, Feynman was revered for his ability to clearly illustrate dense topics like quantum physics for virtually anybody. In Feynman's lost lecture, The Motion of Planets Around the Sun, David Goodstein writes that Feynman prided himself on being able to explain the most complex ideas in the simplest terms. It stemmed from his own study techniques as a student at Princeton University, and he refined the method as a professor and teacher of physics. Most of us have internal monologues in some form or another throughout most of the day. Verbalizing these conversations in the context of problem solving spurs more cognizant attention to how your mind works through a problem. Properly carried out, the Feynman technique will prove whether you really understand a topic or have glossed over certain important concepts. It's also suitable for almost every conceivable subject, allowing you to see the gaps in your knowledge that need to be connected. If you feel your explanations are long, rambling, or protracted, you may not have grasped the subject as well as you might have thought. The usefulness of the Feynman technique is especially helpful in scientific or technological topics, but it's adaptable for any subject. Literature students can use it to narrow down themes. Historians can use it to explain events and historical patterns. And civic students can use it to understand living conditions or urban issues. There's really no restriction on how you can use it. All you need to do is honestly answer the questions you are asking yourself, and you will quickly see where you need to focus your attention. The Feynman technique is a specific application of elaborative interrogation. Remember, the goal is not to actually answer the questions. It's to see what you are unable to answer. That is the information it provides. It has 4 steps. Step 1. Choose your concept. The Feynman technique is very widely applicable. So let's choose one we can use throughout this section, gravity. Suppose that we want to either understand the basics about gravity or explain it to someone else. This can obviously differ depending on what you are learning at the moment. Step 2. Write down an explanation of the concept in plain English. Can you do it? Is this easy or difficult? This is the truly important step, because it will show exactly what you do and do not understand about the concept of gravity. Explain it as simply yet accurately as you can, in a way that someone who knows nothing about the concept would also understand. So going back to the concept we are using, how would you define gravity? Would it be something about being attracted to large masses? Would it be something that makes us fall? Or would it be about how our planet was formed? Can you do it? Or will you resort to saying, well, it's gravity? This step allows you to see your blind spots and where your explanation starts to fall apart. If you can't perform this step, clearly you don't know as much about it as you thought, and you would be terrible at explaining it to someone else. You might be able to explain what happens to objects that are subject to gravity, and what happens when there is zero gravity. You might also be able to explain the causes of gravity. But everything that happens in between might be something you assume you know, but continually skip learning about. Step 3. Find your blind spots. If you are unable to come up with a short description of gravity in the previous step, then it's clear you have large gaps in your knowledge. Research gravity and find a way to describe it in a simple way. You might come up with something like the force that causes larger objects to attract smaller objects because of their weight and mass. Whatever you are unable to explain, this is a blind spot you must rectify. Being able to analyze information and break it down in a simple way demonstrates knowledge and understanding. If you can't summarize it in one sentence, or at least in a brief and concise manner, you still have blind spots you need to learn about. This technique is how you can find them easily and make sure you understand the concepts you are taking notes on and learning. I encourage you to take a second and try this right now. What seemingly simple concept can you try to explain? Can you actually do it? Or does it reveal a lack of understanding somewhere in the process? Step 4. Use an analogy. Finally, create an analogy for the concept. What is the purpose of this step? It's an extension of Step 3. Making analogies between concepts requires an understanding of the main traits and characteristics of each. This step is to demonstrate whether or not you truly understand it on a deeper level, and to make it easier to explain. You can look at it as the true test of your understanding, and whether you still possess blind spots in your knowledge. For example, gravity is like when you put your foot into a pool, and the fallen leaves on the surface are attracted to it because it caused a barely seen impact. That impact is gravity. This step also connects new information to old information and lets you piggyback off a working mental model to understand or explain in greater depth. Of course, it's unlikely that you can do Step 4 if you can't do Steps 2 and 3, but sometimes you can do Steps 2 and 3 and find you can't do Step 4. Now you understand the boundaries of your knowledge and better. The Feynman technique is a rapid way to discover what you know versus what you think you know, and it allows you to solidify your knowledge base. When you keep explaining and simplifying to yourself and discover that you can't, you've just discovered that you don't know as much as you thought you did. Remember, it's another extension of elaborative interrogation, which is where you quiz yourself by asking questions where you can demonstrate your comprehension or lack thereof. Takeaways. Interaction with information. In other words, how to take something that's on the page and screen, understand it, and make it usable to yourself at a later time. That's learning in a nutshell, but there are best practices you should embrace outside of the traditional classroom setting. First is the SQ3R method. Use it. It stands for survey, question, read, recite, review. This is not just a process for attacking a book, but rather a plan for attacking entire disciplines and fields, and whatever you are trying to learn for yourself. Most people will use some elements of the SQ3R method, such as the read and review portion, but without the other elements, deeper comprehension is rarer and more difficult. Second is Cornell Notes. Use them. Cornell Notes splits your note-taking into 3 parts: taking notes, writing cues, and summarizing. In this way, you create your own study guide, with the ability to go into as much detail as you want on command. The fact that you've gone through the information 3 times also doesn't hurt. Finally, self-explanation. Do it. When we are forced to try to explain concepts through self-inquiry, we will quickly discover what we do know and what we don't know at all. These are called blind spots, and they are far more common than you might like to think. Can you explain why the sky is blue? Or how gravity works? Probably not off the top of your head, even though you think you understand those concepts. The Feynman technique is an offshoot of self-explanation that helps find blind spots as well, with an added component of using an analogy to explain what you think you know.